Thank you, Kate, and thank you everybody for coming. Now, the particularly perceptive amongst the audience, the very eagle-eyed who've been able to carefully read between the subtle newspaper coverage and the measured political messages, may have noticed that migrant access to benefits has been a slightly topical issue of recent years. And my presentation is essentially a warning about the direction of travel. So, the EU, our centre of post-national citizenship, our source of cosmopolitanism, of the absence of borders when it comes to equal treatment. And equal treatment embodied in the free movement provisions that all nationalities are treated the same. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that this is a myth. The equal treatment on the grounds of nationality does not exist. It's a chimera, at best a vision that's receding ever further into the horizon. And you'll be able to ascertain that if we look at some of the subtle newspaper headlines. The headlines have been torrential in number and pretty pestilential in tone. They've been targeting, pillorying EU migrants. We've been told that the UK is a honeypot for EU migrants. We've been told that EU migrants will fill the city a size of Manchester. And there are no prizes for guessing which of the newspapers dream these particular headlines up. But there's an odd one out. The headline, "Free movement should be less free." And it's the odd one out for two reasons. Firstly, it's not in one of the usual suspects, but the rather more reputable Financial Times. Secondly, because it was penned by the lesser-known journalist, a Mr. D. Cameron. So we have messages coming from the top, from above, from the Prime Minister, the state, announcing a discriminatory policy, a policy to create an obstacle to movement, that we want fewer EU migrants. And why do we want fewer EU migrants? Well, it's the same old myth that's being peddled about benefit tourism. The idea that migrants arrive here and truck their way straight to the job centre to claim benefits. And this idea has been propounded not just by the media, but by the government itself. And we have a series of government press releases using seriously inflammatory language. And it's the government, it's not the Daily Mail, that have been saying things like, we are accelerating measures to stop rogue benefit claims. We are stopping EU migrants taking advantage of the benefit system. Abuse and clear exploitation of the benefit system will not be tolerated. And that's fighting talk. But what are we fighting? What's the evidence? And that's the million-dollar question. And if anything, there's a whole host of counter-evidence to suggest that EU migrants are not a drain on resources, that they are net contributors to society, fiscally and culturally, and in a whole host of other ways. And there's a series of studies from UCL and from the European Commission that have shown this, and that have shown that the UK actually is the one country where EU migrants are less likely than own state nationals, than UK nationals, to be unemployed. They're more likely to be working. But nevertheless, this idea persists that somehow we need to be doing something about EU migrants. So we've seen a series of legal measures and regulations being put into place, very real measures, a very real hammer to crack an imaginary nut that has very real effects on real people. And the government's own impact assessments of these measures, cutting benefits to EU migrants, restricting access to benefits, are incredibly hazy. about the gains to be made by these measures. In theory, if you put a law in place, it's to create some kind of gain, some kind of advantage to society. But they can't even promise that there's any advantage because they can't identify that there's a problem in the first place. The initial measures that were put into place were all about targeting those evil, unemployed EU migrant benefit tourists who are coming here without a job with no intention to work. The theory. However, even the Daily Mail weren't particularly satisfied with these measures targeting unemployed migrants because, and if we look at the third subheading there, it's unlikely to have an impact on migration, as most EU migrants don't claim. Curse them! They don't even have the decency to be benefit tourists. They have the audacity to come here and work. So here we're getting to the problem, the nub of the problem. It's not actually about benefit tourism. It's about migration and about xenophobia. We want fewer EU migrants here. So what do you do if EU migrants are coming and working and you can't easily exclude them from social rights and you can't easily repel them from your shores? Well, a few things. One thing the government has been proposing, of course, is to reduce or restrict access to in-work benefits for EU migrants as part of its renegotiation leading up to the EU referendum. Now, that's quite a radical-sounding solution because it involves doing away with the principle of non-discrimination effectively. It involves tearing up some of the original treaty principles and fundamental rights. And whether or not that will happen, I mean, it's difficult to say. It seems unlikely. But what they're not telling us is that the government are already doing this. They're already stripping workers, EU workers, of benefits through the very ingenious mechanism of redefining who's a worker. So suddenly we're deciding to tell people that what they're doing is not work, and they are not workers, and therefore we can treat them as economically inactive benefit tourists. The EU test for who is a worker is very broad, deliberately so. It's someone who performs services under supervision of another in return for remuneration, as long as those activities are genuine and effective and excluding activities on such a small scale that they're marginal and ancillary. And that definition deliberately and explicitly includes part-time work, because the European Court of Justice has recognized that part-time work provides an important means of improving the standard of living for very many people in the European Union. So part-time work has to be recognized, has to be protected. The UK, however, has recently introduced a new two-stage test for defining who is a worker, and therefore who is entitled to be part of our welfare state. And that test excludes very, very many part-time workers. It's a two-stage test. The first stage is that it's a minimum earnings threshold. You have to earn at least £155 a week, equivalent to 22 or 23 hours on the national minimum wage, every week for 3 months in the past, and look to continue doing so in the future, and then you can be automatically a worker. If you fail that threshold, you go to the second stage, which is a test of whether or not your work is genuine and effective, which is in theory a holistic test. In theory, pays lip service to the EU test. However, the reality is different. And my research has shown, through working directly with EU nationals and with advice agencies around the UK, that the earnings threshold is being used as all but determinative. That essentially, that's the rule of thumb, that if you earn enough, you can be a worker. If not, it's unlikely. There is a presumption of marginality for part-time workers. There's a presumption that if you're a part-time worker, you are doing marginal and ancillary activity that is not work. And that's evident in the decision-maker guidance, where people are having to decide whether or not someone should be treated as a worker. The guidance issued by the government says, it does not say part-time work is an important means of improving the standard of living for many people. What it says is part-time work is not necessarily always marginal and ancillary. And they're weasel words. They're weasel words that mean part-time work is almost always marginal and ancillary. Part-time work is usually marginal and ancillary. And so the burden of proof shifts to the claimant to show that they should be treated as an exception, that for some exceptional reason their part-time work is genuine and effective. And that's a difficult burden to discharge, and it affects all sorts of people in low-status, low-paid work with erratic hours that go up and down each week, with erratic pay, that move in and out of work, that have a series of temporary agency jobs, that are in part-time work. And this threshold, this all but determinative threshold, does not alter if someone is a lone parent and has caring responsibilities, or if someone has disabilities and a reduced capacity to work. And in this way, it's very highly discriminatory, because for UK nationals, lone parents can't be expected to work by the benefit system more than 16 hours a week. But there is no such gradation if you're an EU national, if you're a lone parent or you have disabilities. And this impacts very dramatically, of course, upon lone parents in part-time work, which essentially means a disparate impact upon women in particular. And hence the picture of the woman and the child who are more likely to be affected by these measures. Women are being told that they are not workers, that the work that they have done has never been work, and they are being pushed over the precipice, the welfare precipice. They're then told that they're not entitled to housing benefit and therefore face eviction because they can't pay their rent, and therefore face homelessness. This is a dramatic and serious impact upon young families that we're dealing with, lone parents. It's quite distressing to go into some of the cases that I've been seeing. I mean, we've had a whole case after case of people who are working 20 hours a week, say, and are still being found not to be workers, to be doing marginal and ancillary work. One case that was referred to me was of a woman who had suddenly been told, after years of thinking she was a worker, quite rightly being told she was a worker, suddenly being told, no, what you're doing is marginal and ancillary, therefore you're not entitled to housing benefit. The only way she could find to pay her rent was to go out at night as a sex worker, leaving her young children on their own. Another case, a woman who was displaced from another place in the UK due to domestic violence, was told that what she had been doing, she had been working all along as part-time worker, had found other work as part-time work, was told that was not work. And therefore she did not have a right to reside, and she was not entitled to housing benefit and faced eviction, in spite of the fact she'd been resident for 13 years in the UK, the majority of her lifetime, and she had a young child. She was, of course, told, had she stayed with the abusive partner, who was a full-time worker, then she'd have had a right to reside on the basis of his right to reside. So we're putting women in a position where they face an appalling choice. If they're in exploitative employment or an abusive domestic situation, should they stay there in order to retain a right to reside, or go, leave that, and suddenly fall off the welfare precipice, have no support? Another case where a woman had already been made homeless with her small child, went to social services, who have some duties, who agreed, yes, we have a duty to house children. We can house your child, but we'll take your child off you. For you, the best we can do is offer you help with a plane ticket home. I mean, how is that a solution? How is that a humane solution? How does that protect family life? These women are being told that what they are doing is not work, that at best they could be job seekers. But even then, they can't be job seekers, really, because what they're doing is marginal and ancillary, and it not only doesn't constitute work, it doesn't even constitute evidence of a prospect of work. You're not workers, and you don't even have a prospect of work. Therefore, you have no right to reside. Therefore, you have no entitlement to housing benefit. Therefore, you get made homeless. This is a welfare safety net that disappears as soon as an EU national needs it. And yet we're quite happy to take their tax and national insurance when they don't. The usual taboos that exist around child homelessness and destitution somehow become more palatable if we're dealing with EU nationals. And I would warn that this increased tolerance of human suffering does not augur well for the future of our welfare system. And it's very important that universities and other independent researchers keep on digging into the rationale and the basis, the evidential basis for laws, and scrutinizing the punitive and damaging human effects of them. Discrimination, persecution, and prejudice should have no place in a civilized society, let alone be codified into that society's laws. I just think we need to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to be? Thank you very much for your time.